Today, we are sitting in the Heinz Suite in San Antonio, Texas, where the American Association of Law Libraries annual meeting is being held. Today, I'm also speaking with Daniel L. Wade. Dan, you are the curator of Foreign and International Law Collection at the Yale University Law School's Lillian Goodman Library. Goldman, I'm sorry, I misspoke. You're also a lecturer in law at the university.
I was, for many years.
For many years. Well, I'll keep that title in then. Why don't we talk a little bit about many years? Could we begin by talking about a little of your personal history?
I was born in 1944 during the war in Gary, Indiana, and shortly after I was born, we moved to the suburb just south of the city called Merrillville. My father was a spectrographer. That is, he was an industrial chemist. He analyzed the content of steel by using the spectrum.
I imagine there was a lot of industry in that area at that time.
Well, certainly he was there because of the war,
Yeah.
and I assume they were cranking out a lot of steel during those war years.
Well, they were using it for a lot of tanks and stuff, I believe, too.
Probably so. And my mother was an elementary school teacher. She was well educated. For that time, she had a master's degree in English from George Peabody, which is an affiliate institution of Vanderbilt. And so she was well educated and well read. I would say I came from a very bookish family.
Sounds like it.
I remember dinner conversations where they talked about either Grant's memoirs or 7 Years in Tibet or other books, and they were always arguing back and forth. So it was a good intellectual environment, a good way to get involved with books. Perhaps one of the reasons why I became a librarian was that when I was in first grade, as my mother was a school teacher, just kind of dropped me off at the library, and I had to wait for her to get out of school. So,
so you got out as a student a bit earlier than
books,
the teachers.
every day, right?
Yeah.
So nice picture books, but I spent a lot of time in the library. My first job. Well, first of all, I should tell you about the wonderful idyllic setting I grew up in. As someone who lives in Washington, you'd appreciate this. I only lived 6 miles from the mills, but I lived in a suburban enough area or a rural enough area that I lived in an area that was like behind it was a natural area. We lived in a humble house, but behind it we had a natural area with a creek, and every year the creek flooded. And it was just absolutely wonderful bird life. Baltimore Orioles, scarlet tanagers, books I'd die for, birds I'd die to see today, and great blue herons.
Don't run into them in New Haven.
It was a wonderful, natural setting, Garden of Eden. So, I really appreciated growing up in that. And my father, being a scientist, we spent many evenings looking at the night skies. At an early age, 10 or 11. I knew my constellations, and he was always studying the moon and using telescope to see what kind of mountains were on the moon and so forth. So he really gave me a sense of nature. At a young age, as a kindergartner, I went to Yellowstone, and later, at about age 10 or 11, he and I went on a trip to the Colorado Rockies. Very memorable events, and kind of taught me about nature, and I still love today.
Yellowstone, with all that the volcanic activity and so on, is a fascinating place. Let's hope it never goes off.
Yeah, it is. It's very fascinating.
Yeah.
So I really enjoyed nature. My first job, I counted worms. So I got paid money. I assume not big money. For counting worms in a worm farm.
Typical boy's job, maybe? I don't think everyone else would want such a job.
And
can I ask what you were counting worms for? Obviously, it probably wasn't to put out the right amount for people buying bait.
We put them in cans and fishermen bought them. So
You were literally doing
I was
that
a commercial worm grower, but I assisted in commercial
Yeah.
worm growing. So it was fun.
Yeah.
And then in high school, I tried to be one of the boys. I played football and wrestled and was just the bomb. I was neither in shape nor particularly well coordinated, but I found my calling as a statistician. So I have a number of high school letters for statistics. So I enjoyed doing that. That was a good way of staying with the boys, so to speak. I took 4 years of Latin. In the fourth year, I entered the state competition, and I finished about, I think, 27th in the state, but there were only about 30 who took it. So
You're
I didn't exactly excel.
Well, I
but
got through Caesar's Gallic Wars second year of Latin, and that was it for me.
So yeah, I enjoyed Latin. I was Latin president. I was Latin club president. I didn't make honor roll society until very late. I think I was about the last person chosen because I had no extracurriculars. I was even at a young age, I was a student. I spent my time studying and not singing or dancing. Make a very poor Yaley, who can do all kinds of things. So I enjoyed those high school years and had a very good friend that we hung out a lot together. Unfortunately, he passed away in 1999, Mark Johnston, but he and I were like soulmates, and we were college roommates. But it was a good high school experience.
Well,
Pretty innocent. It was an age of innocence.
We were all, it was a very different era. I remember I was part of it too. If we were naughty, it was a whole different, I mean, we caught smoking behind the gym or something.
Right, exactly.
And that
No
was
drugs.
not the worst thing you could do.
Many fewer temptations.
Yeah, well, maybe they were still around, but we didn't know
Right,
it.
exactly. I had a sheltered
So you
existence.
completed your education through high school, and then
Right.
you went to college.
College. Well, first of all, let me tell you, I guess the most unique thing about my education is that I have formally studied in a classroom setting, if I count English, I have to count English, 15 languages.
Wow.
I've written apparently 13, but I can now expand it to 15. So there was a whole lot of time spent learning languages and a whole lot of time forgetting languages. So, but language was kind of my major study.
Well, putting together an array of degrees must be too, because you have at least 4 master's degrees, and I don't know too many people who have that many, if any.
Well, I had a very kind wife, let's just put it that way, an indulgent wife who let me pursue my studies for a very long time. But let's go back to college. College, I went to a small liberal arts college in northeastern Indiana called Manchester College. It's kind of like Nazareth, nothing good has ever come out of North Manchester, Indiana. It's only about 4,000 students.
I don't know,
we
maybe
did
the
have
locals wouldn't say that.
Yeah, we did have an undersecretary of the United Nations, Andrew Cordier, and the person who invented what is it called? The stuff that keeps you from Teflon. That keeps you from the pans from sticking. So
you can
had a
cook,
chemist,
your food without having it all
right.
stick
And
to the pan.
the school produced a lot of teachers and doctors, and people who supposedly did good. It was affiliated with the Church of the Brethren, which is one of the historic peace churches like Mennonites and Quakers. I had wonderful faculty there. I mean, by Ivy League standards, they were nothing because they published nothing.
No.
But they were
But they
very
were
good
good
teachers,
teachers.
and they were very caring and concerned about young students. And so I had an absolutely wonderful time there. My philosophy professor was the one who married Carol and I, my wife of 48 years. And I had a wonderful German teacher who introduced me to world literature. Very good German. Taught me very good German.
Sounds like sort of very broad-based,
Very,
kind of
yeah, like-
undergraduate curriculum
right.
of the classical type.
Right, and so I had 2 years of French, 2 years of German.
Uh-huh.
You know, kind
Well,
of very
you
broad.
sort of developed
and was a
expertise in languages.
was a history major. You know, so I could, those languages were relevant.
Uh-huh.
So that was good. And I went through college in 3 years, so I was still pretty immature. So I went to graduate school. And had my first MA is in medieval Islamic history. There I studied Arabic, Turkish, modern Hebrew,
Uh-huh.
and again focused on history.
Studying Islamic culture and so on was, I would imagine, fairly uncommon in the United States in that era. Isn't that
Right. I have to confess that I supported myself for a number of years with national defense grants. We lived on like $2,000. What a different age when gasoline was 29 cents a gallon and, and the milk was 29
instead of $4 or whatever it is these days.
Right.
Yeah.
But they would give us a small scholarship to study a language, so I had both scholarships in both Turkish and Arabic.
Yeah. I remember when I was in library school, I had, because of the way it lined up, I had some electives I could take, and I took a course, a couple of them actually, because I was so fascinated with the first one, in Islamic literature. And I forget all of what we studied, but I had to write a paper as part of the second course. And so I went to the law library, and you know there was a fair amount of stuff on Islamic law, and I wrote up an analysis comparing marital law and that culture with our own. And it was an interesting paper. The professor liked it very much. I was very pleased. He gave me a good grade too.
Oh, very good.
Yeah.
So then I was drafted. This is about 1968. But I had a conscious objector status. So I did have a position as a translator in Cyprus. But we decided that it made more sense, since my wife had an education, that I would enter seminary. So I went to seminary after my first 2 years in graduate school at Indiana. Seminary, I became an ordained Church of the Brethren minister. I just recently retired. And very concerned about the values that that church emboldens and promotes. It's just horribly struggling with the gay issue.
Oh,
As some,
well, they all
as some
are,
Protestant,
I think.
as some Protestant denominations are, and it's struggling today with that. But certainly, as far as teaching issues of peace and simplicity and concern for one's fellow man, was very good. And there, I focused on biblical languages. I focused on Greek and Hebrew. That put me into graduate school, and I also studied Latin with the Benedictines, which was a lot of fun for a low church Protestant.
So you got a little bit of the Catholic influence in some place too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then, so then I went to Chicago to study the history of religions. My dissertation advisors were Moshe Eliade, who's famous in comparative religion, and Jonathan Z. Smith, who is comparativist and a very creative, exotic thinker. My erstwhile dissertation, unfinished because of poor design and sheer drudgery, was called The Tongue of Sweet-Smelling Ointment. And I was trying to argue that the Apostle Paul used thaumaturgical, which is magical language. Martin Smith at Columbia had written a book on Jesus the Magician, arguing that he was basically out of this community of wonder workers. And I was going to substantiate that with writing about comparing Paul. But just a sheer comparison of it, I bogged down and didn't finish it.
Your ABD, I think it's called, or
Yeah,
did you
right.
get that far? Yeah.
Then I went to work, about ready to start a family. I worked at Kirkland & Ellis, a major law firm, for 5 years in the field of ERISA, and also in tax. And I went to law school, night law school, thinking that I'd be a tax professor, but I learned that my aptitude probably did not lie in that area. It's interesting, I kind of have my mother's genes, and my brother, who's 8 years younger, has my father's genes, because he teaches advanced mathematics and physics.
So he's
He just recently retired. He was very much the quantitative mind, and unfortunately, when it came to spin-off corporations, I didn't have such a quantitative mind. So,
well, Dan, I've always known you in our field, and as an expert in foreign and international law. But you talk about this background in, divine or what do they call it? More of a religious background. Did you ever actually work as a minister as well?
One internship. That was about it. I went into it thinking that I would be a professor. I've always I looked to the academic life as kind of the ideal life. But I did have a year experience where I was a youth minister.
Well, I suppose now you're on the Yale campus, and as I remember, almost all the buildings in my day there looked like they were churches. And
I'm very active in Center Church on the Green, the established congregational church founded in 1638. And so I'm on various and sundry committees. I enjoy writing sermons. I preach a couple times a year. So I still have an active religious church life, and as far as outside activities, that would be a major, certainly a major one.
Perhaps before we sort of move along into your profession, are there any other interests or hobbies or special passions that
we haven't finished education yet. My education is so extensive.
Oh, that's right. You had, as I said, you had at least four master's degrees. You worked on a doctorate.
Right. I've got to get through law school.
That's right.
I had Sharif Bassioni as my international law professor, who kind of introduced me to international law. He's well published and his name well known, and he can be seen as kind of the originator, the person who had the vision of having an international criminal court. So I think he's quite significant. And then wanting to stay in academia, I decided that I would go to library school. And so I commuted from Chicago to the University of Illinois. And during my librarianship, I worked with Edward Coligier, who is a securities specialist. So I was kind of a bibliography research bibliographer in international relations and security issues when I was there. So I had a good year experience of doing that.
Could you mention the specific schools where you did your law and library?
Law is DePaul.
Okay.
And I was in the generation.
Chicago.
I had as models or as people who went before me, Judith Wright in Chicago, and Judith Gaskell, who was at DePaul and then ultimately became librarian for
very
Supreme
highly
Court.
regarded.
Right.
And still in Washington D.C.
And the bishop's daughter.
And the bishop's daughter.
Somebody who could empathize with me. So So they were good role models.
Now, did they have some role in sort of attracting you into our niche of the legal profession, law librarianship?
I think so. And Bill Murray, do you remember Bill Murray?
Yes.
He definitely did.
Yeah. Murray or Murphy?
Murphy, I guess.
Murphy, in Chicago. He was an ALL president.
I didn't realize he was president of AAL.
Yeah, he was a major player.
Right, and his assistant also kind of influenced me with the direction. I called Mrs. Gallagher thinking that I would go to Washington, but we were started in a young family, and she pretty much didn't want me as a student. I had a secure job working at Kirkland, and she figured that making money and not moving was probably a whole lot easier on me than...
young child, you probably had to have that as one of your priorities.
So so I didn't go to Washington. I can't be one of those Washington elite.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know. I hear the Washington elite, but there are all other groups that are pretty elite too. Certainly, a lot of them came out of University of Texas program with Roy Mirsky. So you got your library degree
At Illinois.
in Illinois.
Right.
Okay. So
Rick
you-
Searles was my legal reference teacher,
Oh.
research teacher, and Tim Curley was the role model there.
All right.
And Nancy Johnson was also, she spent some time with me, kind of gave me a sense of things.
Uh-huh.
Um,
A
and-
few people, I remember
Right.
all of them.
And my first AALL was 1982 Detroit.
All
I don't know
right.
if you remember that.
In,
and
in
it-
the center where GM is now has their headquarters, Renaissance.
So Blanca Coudet, who was the foreign international law librarian at NYU, and Simone Marie Kleckner, both of them emigres, gave a program on foreign international legal research. And so this is before I really went to library school, but I decided this is what I wanted to do.
Mhm.
So I kind of had to focus on that from early on.
Mhm.
That's what I wanted to do.
So you finished up with all these backgrounds and so on, and then was your first job as a librarian at the University of Houston or
No, it was at Vanderbilt.
Vanderbilt? Oh.
Vanderbilt. I had my library science education, but I didn't have much in the way of real in-depth knowledge of foreign and international law. And that's what Igor
Now,
Kavas
you
could
were
give
at
me.
Vanderbilt with one of the real masters, Igor Kavas.
Right. Kavas was
Tell us
a
about a
bastard.
bit about that
I would say,
experience.
I assume you've met him.
I did, yes.
I mean,
Yeah, he
just
was still active in my early days.
incredibly charming.
Yeah.
President of IALL.
Uh-huh.
He had lived in 12 countries and spoke fluently 5 languages. And he had a good sidekick called Dolph Spoods, who was librarian at Chicago.
Mhm.
They were both Latvians.
Yeah.
Whose writing was probably more helpful to me in my early education
Uh-huh.
than Igor's. So that year I worked as quote-unquote librarian, but really much of what I did was as a research assistant.
Hmm.
So I really learned the bibliography of foreign international law working with Igor. We wrote a book on international business transactions. I just read the title, cover page.
Yeah.
And so he gives me I wasn't a co-author, but I rendered assistance.
Uh-huh.
And, but in fact, I worked about 3 months on it. Igor worked 1 weekend. But he took all my research, everything I had found.
He was a little ahead of you in being able to make more efficient use of his time,
very
perhaps,
publishable. So
at that point.
yeah.
Would you describe him if you were asked to name mentors, if you had any? Would he be
Well, he certainly had to be
prominent in
He
that?
was
Yeah.
probably the prominent
Yeah.
mentor I had. I mean, then after Vanderbilt, I moved on to Houston,
Mm-hmm.
where I had the title Foreign International Librarian. At Vanderbilt, I had the title of Government's Documents Librarian, but we had a documents assistant who did 90% of the work, so I could be the research assistant.
You arrived in Houston actually a few years after I had been there, but you got there I think in about '83, and I
Right.
had left before I went
Right.
to Yale, so it was about 10, 12 years in between us.
So, I mean, John really taught me how to be a librarian, I think.
Okay.
I gave me much more responsibility, and I had done very little
This
references.
is John Schultz.
John Schultz. Very little reference at Vanderbilt, and so I had a regular reference routine I taught. One of the more interesting things we did at Houston was that he would send me with the Houston summer program to Mexico City, and I would collect books.
Yeah.
And I probably collected, I would say, 2,000 or 3,000 of them. We'd bring them back. I'd have somebody who knew the language well deal with the customs officials, and then he would meet me at the airport with his pickup truck, And we'd slug them all on, and he'd drive them back to the library, and they'd spend the year cataloging them. So that was a lot of fun. Unfortunately, University of Houston suffered a major flood.
Yes,
and
unfortunately,
it's
it
all
was
wiped
a
out.
building that was built, a complex, and the library was sunken below ground. And in Houston, that's risky, as you know, and they found out when the hurricane surge came.
Right. So Spencer Simon's, what he had left of my work was the insurance money. That's what it boils down to. I mean, the
So
collection was
these were all
completely
down
gone.
in the lower section, which
Yeah,
all
they
got
were all
flooded.
in
Oh, what
lower
a shame.
section, all gone.
Yeah, the Mexican program was just being started when I was there.
Yeah, I
in
think
the
it
late
was, it was
60s.
very vigorous when I was
And
there.
there were some books coming at that time, but it
yeah.
sounds like you were developing that much more extensively.
Right.
In your collection of building is international and foreign law at Houston, did you also select other from other countries, or?
Certainly a few, German, French, I think
Okay.
predominantly. So some more from Latin America. We had a little,
Imagine your
compared to Yale
your-
standards, we had a very limited budget, but
Yeah. Well, I
we're
imagine your
expanding.
language skills were very helpful,
Yeah, right.
especially
yeah.
in cataloging and understanding what it was you were supposed to say.
Well, we had a Cuban cataloger, so that
Oh,
they were predominantly Spanish, and so she could certainly handle that.
okay, good.
Uh,
Well, that was an interesting building concept, I remember.
Right,
They're
right.
now in the process, they're still in it, but I understand from the current librarian that they have been working on trying to get a new building. I mean, after 40 or so years, it's
interesting.
certainly understandable
right, right.
that they may have outgrown that one, or, you know. And buildings are designed for the life expectancy these days of about 30 or 35 years, so there's probably not just old technology now by today's standards, but it's all started wearing out anyhow.
Right. Hopefully they'll do it above ground, so
Yeah, well, I think that
the
would be the
collection won't
choice.
be, I don't know if there'll be much of a print collection, but it won't be
Well,
in
it's my
jeopardy.
understanding that where the real flood came through the underground tunnels. The University of Houston had all its utilities underground through tunnels, which is great for maintenance because you can get at everything, but so could the storm water from the hurricane. And the law library, as I understand it, was sort of the low point on the entire campus, so that's where it all went once it reached into the system.
Yeah.
Oh, that was a shame. So you were there when that occurred, or had it?
No, I
was
left in
after?
'87, so it was significantly later.
Okay.
I'm not sure the exact date.
Yeah, I guess John Schultz, your director, sort of wrapped up his career dealing with that
Right.
as an aftermath. That must have been very unfortunate.
Yeah, discouraging, I would think.
Yeah, very, very normal.
Because he put a lot of physical labor into moving those books.
Mhm.
I don't think of library directors slinging around boxes filled with books, but
Yeah.
he
Well,
did.
then you moved from the University of Houston to Yale, the
Right.
Law School Library, and could you talk a little bit about some of the things you do there and have done, and maybe some of the special things you find that you've been involved in? I know one of them has been cooperative collection development work.
Right.
Yeah.
So I came to Yale in '87,
Uh-huh.
and I worked first as a foreign international law librarian, and then with Diana Davis's taking over the directorship
Mhm.
in '91, I became associate librarian for foreign international law, and I stayed that for 20 years, and then have my current title as curator of the foreign international law collection. I was happy to see how often the keynote speaker this morning used the term curator as a reference for librarians.
I remember the first time I heard that title used by a law librarian was Julius Mark at New York U at the time, and he was named curator of whatever the sub part of the title was. And we were all sort of impressed by that. It was a little different.
So I'd like to read this into the record,
Please
if I
do.
may. This is my kind of my last will and testament. It's called Wisdom from Mount Nebo.
Hold it up so the camera can see the cover.
It's just an off print.
Yeah. Ah.
Do you know your Bible, Mount Nebo?
Not
No.
as well as I might.
That's where
but-
Moses looked into the promised land.
Okay.
Say, this is my looking into the promised land.
All right, so you're on high looking
Right. And
out.
so this is what I wrote to the younger generation of law librarians. But this is what I wanted to say about Yale. I know you have a Yale experience. I'm very
Mine
fond.
was a bit more limited than yours.
I'm very fond of this. Yale trains judges. Harvard trains lawyers. Yale doesn't teach you any law. Harvard teaches you nothing but. Yale turns out socially conscious policymakers. Harvard turns out narrow legal technicians. Yale thinks that judges invent the law. Harvard thinks that judges discover the law. Yale is preoccupied with social values. Harvard is preoccupied with abstract ideas. Yale is interested in personalities. Harvard is interested in cases. Yale thinks most legal doctrine is ritual mumbo jumbo. Harvard thinks it comprises a self-contained logical system. Yale cares about results. Harvard cares about precedents. Yale thinks law is what the judge has for breakfast. Harvard thinks it is a brooding omnipresence in the sky. So that's kind of life at Yale. It's very policy oriented. I taught research methods with Michael Reisman, who, along with McDougall, was really the founders
did you
and
get to
thinkers of
work-
the New Haven School.
Were you able to work with Myers McDougall, or
No,
was he
I
gone by
I
then?
barely knew him, but
Yeah.
I did know of him, and he was always my special hero
Yeah.
because he kind of kept
was
kept an
very
office
kind-
like mine.
He was very kind to those of us in the library too. He would come along, and of course, he was one of the really high-level faculty members in my day.
Do you remember his office?
A
It
little
kind of
bit,
looks
yeah.
like Japan and after Hiroshima.
Yeah,
I mean,
well,
it's just a totem
a
aside.
number of them I've
I
seen
keep an
over the
office
years.
that's not a whole lot different from that. So he was always my my hero as far as here's a man who published a tremendous amount of
I can
material.
also remember some of the faculty members, the most senior ones, having wonderful offices with windows, with stained glass.
Overlooking the courtyard.
Yeah, overlooking the interior courtyard. Yeah, that was nice.
So I'd say my major work at Yale has been collection development. We add about 4,000 foreign international titles a year. There are a number of selectors on the staff who select it, so it's not all my doing, but I have oversight for it. So I figure over 30 years, I've added about 120,000 foreign international volumes to the Yale collection. And we say we have a collection of about 200,000 foreign international law titles.
Sounds
so,
like it must be one of the major ones, certainly in this country.
academic
Yeah.
wise, LA County is twice our size, so I mean, yet in probably Library of Congress is something other, but for an academic library, it's certainly they're probably just behind Harvard. I don't know, Columbia might have something to say about that, but
Well, there were sort of a rivalry between the schools,
Right, exactly.
but that's healthy.
Right. So another thing that I am very proud of and was engaged in was cooperative collection development. So Kent McKeever, Blanca Cadet, and I in the late 80s came together, I think with, I don't want to say prompting, but certainly with the influence of Buckwalter at Harvard.
Okay.
He knew what was going on.
So you were dealing with Harvard and Columbia
And NYU.
and NYU.
To begin
Right.
with. And so we started talking about cooperative collection development, countries we would focus on, that kind of thing. And now it's developed into that we've added Cornell, Penn, Fordham, Georgetown. The group meets 2 or 3 times a year, and it's kind of shifted from being so much concerned about print collections, which is still Yale's major concern, and they spent a lot of time talking about electronic databases. So there's kind of been a shift that way. But certain, building on Arlen, there was an Arlen experience of maybe 5 to 10 years previous where they assigned Latin American countries to institutions. three institutions initially divided up kind of the world as to what we would collect, and that's kind of where we put our emphasis in our.
Now, for
money.
those who are watching who may not know what Arlen is, it's an alternative to OCLC.
Right.
You want to mention a little bit about how it differed? I know it was the research libraries that were academic.
Exactly, and they had, I think they were basically working on kind of, it was formed to work on cooperative cataloging, but I'm just kind of interested in this very special area of foreign international law collecting, and a few years before I came to Yale, Arlen had a project of measuring all the collections, and you could say how many cubic feet of you had for a given country, and in what depth you collected it. And then they had
Well, it was
large
really,
charts.
I think libraries, at least initially, had to be sort of invited to be part of it too. It was not an automatic thing, and they wanted to pick libraries that were peers.
So it's really major projects.
So everybody could basically contribute
Right.
more or less equitably to the totality of the resources.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So this group, we call it the Northeast Foreign Law Librarians Cooperative Group, with the acronym NEFLCOG, is carried on, and they're still working together and cooperating, and I'm very happy for it.
Well, I suppose it empowers the institutions to offer their primary users a much broader array of potential titles. I mean, they may not be right down the hall like a stack would be in the building, but they're
Well,
accessible.
Technology is really changing things too. We now have Borrow Direct, so not, I guess not all NEFLCOG schools are involved in Borrow Direct, and law schools aren't involved in Borrow Direct. But I am interested in religion, and probably need more religion than law. Can find a very current, very popular book. It's checked out at Yale, but I have access to it so that I can request it from Princeton, Harvard, Penn, wherever, and they can deliver it to me in 2 days. So that's just wonderful. And I know our policy now is that don't recall books, use Borrow Direct and see if you can get a book from another institution.
So the idea is
So-
if somebody has the book, presumably they're using it, and
Right.
it's better to let
It's
them
really,
continue if you
it's
can
really
do so.
connecting the collections,
Yeah.
and they're willing to pay the postage, which must be considerable. But
Well, it may, I mean, the bang for that buck may well be worth it.
right.
Yeah.
So I think this is a marvelous development, and I'm waiting for the law schools to, to opt in. And I guess it's expensive. Your catalog has to be mounted into the database, but
No.
I think this will happen, and it'll make it even a much stronger collection. So we're collecting for many more people than just the local Yale user. I mean, you can use Interlibrary Library alone today, but this is so much easier than you do it yourself, and you do it through the catalog, and so it's really, it looks very accessible.
Now you're talking about borrowing and loaning essentially books, but how about digital as well? Or
Yeah, I don't think we're to that.
yeah, I know. I remember last fall, D.R. Jones, who's the director at the University of Memphis Law Library, wrote a very interesting piece, I thought, in the Law Library Journal, which published. In fact, she just got the Article of the Year award at this annual meeting for that article. And I read that, and she talked, and I've been retired 11 years, so I'm not really quite part of this world. She said that now with so much digital information and the fact the library licensed the use of it as opposed to owned it, that it's changed the realities of how you can make it available to other users or to other libraries. Now the publisher, of course, can do so for a fee, and will. But, so in a sense, everybody has better access in that sense, but it's changed the equation. So when I hear these initiatives that you're describing, I am assuming you do not have to run into that kind of a question, at least not yet.
Right, exactly. So.
Yeah, that's interesting. So cooperative collection development now involves certainly the schools you named.
Right, I mean,
minutes ago.
that's the group that I've been involved with.
Well, they're all major players in terms of traditional collection building, and I suppose that continues.
Right.
And I asked a question about Yale. I remember in the days I was there, we were pretty tight on space for books and everything else. We were using a piece of the underground portion of the Beinecke Book Library,
Right.
which was immediately across the street.
Well, that's a major part of my history, in that when I came to Yale, that's what I oversaw. We call it the Annex, if you
Yeah,
remember.
that's right.
Remember that? And
There was a little tunnel into
we
the
just
street.
nurtured
to get
and
into
cared,
it.
and I was just basically a father for 30 graduate students.
Uh-huh.
But then in the mid-90s, it was decided by wisdom of the powers on high that the graduate students should be assimilated.
Oh.
So the library
So
was
moving back across the
renovated
street.
and all gone. So all that is gone.
Yeah.
And we had people who actually lived in the library.
We did in my day too, because the rents were high enough. They had little cuticles with doors.
Right,
and
exactly.
It was very, very
Right,
nice.
Right, and we would page them. And they had good connections with their families at that time. And,
Yeah. I remember this was the student unrest era. We got a call one day from the people running the Beinecke Library, and they were appalled. One of the back stairwells was reeking of marijuana smoke. And it was obviously got to be one of our people who did it. We were not quite as concerned about that. And that's long before I lived in a state where it's now legal to smoke. But it was an interesting place. So Yale no longer uses those stacks, or
Well, they do use the stacks, but in a different way. I mean, they're no carrels, they're stacks.
okay.
And in the bottom floor, it was originally 3 levels, and now it's only 2 levels.
All right.
But in that bottom level, it's on movable shelving, and they can hold 500,000 books.
Wow.
Those shelves. So
you've put in a lot of
the
compact
high and
shelving
intense,
and-
yeah, shelving. We also now have a library shelving facility where there's several 100,000 of our volumes that are off-site.
Okay.
But they basically use that space as holding a lot of books.
Now the off-site, is it a university-wide kind of thing?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Mhm.
Yeah, that would seem to make a lot of
Yeah.
sense. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that they're on their second big warehouse of
Yeah.
holding
We
several million
developed
volumes.
a similar type of facility in the Washington D.C. area while I was still there. The consortium of university libraries, colleges and university libraries built a big repository for off-site storage east of the city.
Right.
And I think it's still going strong. They had one warehouse, or whatever you call this, vault. It was all controlled climate and everything, and they had plans for 4 more on that site. They had the space. It was just a matter of when they needed them, they built them. And I don't know what they've done since, but the concept I've seen
Right.
other places. And it does make sense. We put early on some of our extra copies of things that we weren't ready quite yet to weed from the collection, but we didn't have space to house in our building. We put them out there.
We basically put all of our older foreign law off-site, using cutoff dates of 1980 and 1990. So we've done that.
That
The
was
other
a-
thing we should mention when we're talking about libraries is we should talk about the electronic document repository. Yale now has a document repository. I have nothing to do with it, but it
No.
has 6,000 documents in it. And the most popular happens to be an international law article from our former dean, Dean Coe. But that's certainly a way of saving space. Tremendous amount
Well, I
of space.
imagine so, yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So that's kind of the wave of the future, I think.
Good. Well, speaking of things sort of moving on outside of the institution more, not just for off-site storage, but you have been active in professional organizations over the years. Can we talk a little bit about some of that? You worked for ALL, Foreign Comparative International.
Well, I'll just tell you about what I'm doing
Special
at this conference to begin with, and we
Yeah,
can talk about the
tell us
others.
about some of this.
So,
You have
yesterday,
another prop or two too, maybe at some point you can
Yeah.
show us those.
so yesterday I manned or personed the FCIL SIS
right.
table.
We have
for,
to use up the
right,
tech
exactly.
terminology now.
Well, they're basically women at the table, so it's hard to say, man. The FCIL SAS table for the new Connell members, the people who are coming to get oriented.
Yeah, the new law,
into
the
profession.
first time attenders or
Right,
so.
right,
Yeah.
right. And this evening I'll chair the Foreign Law Selectors, which is a group that is concerned about national and cooperative collection development, and get reports from Library of Congress and from LMC, from LA County, from Marcy Hoffman, who's responsible for certain electronic tools like the Index of Foreign Legal Periodicals, and a report from NEFLCOG. And in the morning, I get the honor of being the oldest active foreign international law librarian. There's an award for the newest person into our profession.
Well, you live
so
long enough, you'd be surprised that you're eligible to be.
I get to bestow that. And then on Tuesday morning, I'm chairing a book discussion on the crisis in the Ukraine. So I have a number of active activities that keep me
You're certainly
engaged.
up to the moment on what the topics are too of interest. Yeah.
Right. And over time, kind of preparing for the interview, I discovered that I'd worked on 10 different programs and two workshops. In 1988 we did I Like the Art workshop on Latin American law. And this is another example of kind of handouts I've done over the years. Wade's Roadmap to Success in Researching Foreign Comparative and International
Looks
Law.
like you have a road between about where you are in the east and maybe where
It must
Bob
have
Berry
been,
and
it must have been
company
a program in
are,
San Francisco or so, right?
Yeah,
right.
University of
So-
California at Berkeley maybe on the other end.
Right.
Yeah.
So, done that. Was involved in the founding of two SISs, Special Interest Sections, the Foreign Comparative International Law SIS. I was the fourth president and the first newsletter editor. And I was involved in creating what we call I think, interest groups today. They're kind of regional groups for the most part. I kind of was responsible for getting those started. And then Morris, when I came to Yale, had me help found Legal History and Rare Books SIS.
This would be Morris Cohen, who was
Right,
the
Morris
director
Cohen,
for a while
exactly.
at Yale after being at
Is there another
Harvard, after being at Penn.
Right, is there another Morris?
Oh,
So, and unfortunately, the wisdom of our arch enemies, the people who design the programming at these conferences, they've always put the activities of Legal History and Rare Books against FCIL.
Yeah.
So I really have never been very active, and I participated in a few activities, but
Well, unfortunately, I understand that some people just say they can't devote away from their jobs the weeks after weeks of time that would take to do this all the way we'd like.
right, exactly. So I was involved in the creation of that.
Yeah.
And that's really a fun area. That's an area that's really growing at Yale is rare books. Spending a lot of money on that. They're trying to.
Now, are you doing this in-house in the law school, in the library, or with the Beinecke Rare Book?
No, we're doing it in-house.
Okay. You know, the director over at Beinecke now is the son of one of our colleagues, Schroeder, Ed Schroeder is his son.
Right.
And I didn't know this until I visited with Ed a few weeks ago. And, he was talking about it.
Right.
Yeah, that was it was a small world, because in those days, being, using some of the space in the Beinecke, one of my roles as the assistant law librarian or librarian at Yale was to network with the people at Beinecke, and I got to know all the people at that time that were over there that were in charge. And when I would have visitors to town, they would invite me to join my visitors and come down and tour some of the stuff down in the stacks. They had some fascinating rare books
they do. They just
interesting artifacts. There was a playing card collection that some of them went back hundreds of years.
Oh, wow.
It was fascinating to look at those and know about the history. So you're doing more rare books now in the law school.
Right. We're really, I'd say, have major efforts in that effort.
Now you must have a room for them or a place
Yeah,
to
and
store them
they're
properly
actually
and display
using,
them.
they're creating more and more space for them, so it's sizable.
Yeah, we had at that time the collection of Blackstone's commentaries,
Right.
some of which were pretty rare.
Anne Likely is just, who was an associate director under Morris,
Oh,
has just finished her definitive bibliography of Blackstone titles.
mm-hmm.
She worked very hard on it for very long, kind of in the spirit of Morris.
Yeah.
And so she probably was publishing a comprehensive bibliography.
I remember Morris, who was, of course, quite prominent when I first came in, and for many years. I always viewed him as a real scholar, librarian, more so than many of us who were more into the nuts and bolts of administration. And we may have taught and done
Right.
some work, but Morris was in another league. I mean,
He was really a bibliophile's bibliophile.
truly, yeah, that's putting it well, I think, yeah. And he followed up a handful of our colleagues over the years who were like that. Hicks, Fred Hicks, who was the librarian at Yale back in the 20s and the 30s, I think, was somewhat in that category. Beardsley out at the University of Washington was more of a writer than probably a hands-on librarian, although he was the head librarian at the University of Washington Law Library back before Marion Gallagher and now Penny Hazelton and others have been there. And they were scholars in a different way than many of us. Yeah. People I always looked up to.
Right.
Yeah, and Morris was a real nice guy too. Yeah. Good. Now, you talked about the work you've done with the ALL and around that. Have you been active in the International Association of Law Libraries or any of the other IFLA? Or any of those?
Not very. I mean, I think that's a real problem in the system. Is that the tension to really do cooperative things, you need everybody at the table.
Yeah.
And the idea of having foreign junkets that IALL offers pulls people away from the table. So I'm, not so happy with IALL. Tension. And my colleagues, they're going. 2 of them are going to Buenos Aires in a few weeks.
Yeah, I've been hearing offhand comments about that from time to time in this meeting. People who are going to be part of that.
Right.
Yeah, and it sounds like it's an interesting, event to be part of.
Right. I attended 3 of them in the
Yeah.
course of my career.
Something I think I've noticed over the years, I was never active in the International Association of Law Libraries, but I had a friend who had been in law school with me who was also a law librarian who was president of that and very active for many years, but never particularly participated much in AELL. So maybe there's a difference in where people's interests and where they operate or where they.
Some
do
people
their
can
time.
find, attending both,
Yeah.
but it's not too many that are that way.
Well, years ago there were a lot of foreign legal specialists and scholars from Europe who had come here to this country around the time of World War II or shortly thereafter. There were still a few of them still active when you and I came into the field, but. And that was a tradition early on, that you had some of these really fine people from that tradition.
Well, we have our incoming chair is one of those people from the Czech Republic,
Oh, yeah.
but she's kind of the exception. There are not too many that are doing it.
Yeah. Claire Germain,
Right,
who's down in
she-
Florida,
yeah.
is another who's basically probably a little more, for many of us, known as an academic regular
And there's
American law librarian.
There's
But
certainly
she's
a,
not, she's from
a
France.
segment of our membership that come from Asia. I have a colleague who grew up in Hong Kong, and I'm sure there are any number of other Chinese librarians. I met another one just recently who have come over and are now librarians here.
Yeah, I've known a few. Frank Liu at Duquesne is originally from China, and then his father was actually a general in the Chinese Nationalist Army and fled to Taiwan when the communists took over in the late 40s. And then he ended up in this country, and he's, of course, basically here, I think, ever since. But he still goes back and involved in a lot of efforts with Chinese scholars. He's well connected, as I understand it, in many of the university settings over there, and has contacts and works with them. And others are working with him on that. So there's still some of that going on. Yeah.
There tend to be programs, I think, back and forth at either in China or in the United States every 2 years now.
Yeah, and I've heard of sort of over a meal function the other day, somebody describing one that wasn't too far back, that in fact Frank was involved with, where their venue they thought had all been worked out in Beijing suddenly fell through.
Oh, wow.
They didn't have a lot of time. And they scurried around and got another place. And it worked beautifully. But, you know, the interesting problems here, you know, you sign up for one of these annual meetings venues several years in advance, and, you know, they have contracts and stuff. And that means something in this country, maybe different than it does over there. I don't know. But it was an interesting, hair-raising tale to hear about how some of the behind the scenes work in getting those joint programs underway and sometimes convey.
Right.
Well, you know, we've talked about a lot of things. You've been sort of, you know, many of us recognize you, Dan, as a real expert in your field, and I think that's well deserved. And it's an expertise that, unfortunately, for whatever reason, is not that broadly shared with many of your colleagues. You're sort of a special person. You're almost a successor to the
I think
the scholars
I'm
that I was
older.
mentioning.
I'm older by a decade than probably anybody else in my special section. So, you know, that gives me
You're growing your replacements then, I guess.
one-upmanship. Yeah.
That's good. One of the things I ask in some of these, and I want to ask it to you, is do you have any sort of thinking ahead? I know this is very dangerous because one doesn't really know the future and times are changing. Where do you think it may be headed? More joint cooperation, more digital? What?
Well, certainly more digital work. We have the work of Andrew Keen to talk about, and I was happy to hear him say this morning that this is the keynote speaker for this convention, for this annual meeting, that Harvard, Yale, and Berkeley will be around in 100 years. That's comforting.
You and I won't be to see.
But he's not very optimistic about the rest of it. And I'm on the wrong side of technology to really speak about technology. I imagine things are going to become more and more digital, and who knows. And he said it'll probably be 100 years before there will be artificial intelligence that needs no human to operate it. So in 100 years, I'm a little bit anxious about our profession, just what artificial intelligence is going to do to the world. But
maybe then we'll become a human race of all consumers and users of all this technology.
Right. Maybe
they'll do all the
we'll have more
generating
time
of the income.
Maybe we'll have more time to read
resources. Or something.
I would say that my hobby horse and the thing that I would really want to hope for my generation is that we preserve the conservative bastion as gatekeepers of these collections, and that we work to be elite, and that we continue to improve our knowledge base by study and just increasing our breadth of knowledge. As you can imagine, being responsible for 190 countries, it's a tremendous, 190 legal systems, it's a tremendous challenge, but that's one that I hope that my successors will continue to work on and be involved in staying very active mentally and through study. I mean, Morse Cohen is a model of the kind of work we should continue to do. I get worried when I see the whole world working with their iPhones and fewer people reading books. But
Or even if they're reading
I'm just an
books,
old
they're
man, that's all.
not in book form anymore. They're on these tablets of one sort or another. Yeah.
Right, exactly.
And yet, it's been said that when the Gutenberg movable press, movable type press was invented in the 1400s for the Western world, that created an ability to print books for the first time in any quantity, and created the opportunity to put together the Western university system throughout Europe and now
Right.
other places, and that the digital shift that's underway now may actually do the same kind of thing for the entire world. Places that just can't.
The democratization of knowledge, that's what
Yeah.
Mr. Keene was talking about this
Yeah,
morning.
and maybe I think that's sort of positive. I hope, but let's hope that in 100 years, those computers you were describing will
Right,
do.
but he also then talked about the decreasing law school enrollments and decreasing number of librarians. That with all this democratization, there'll be less need for librarians and.
Although, with all this coming
Our
along, it sometimes requires the skills we bring to the table to
Right,
help other
right.
people access
Exactly.
all that
I mean, with
huge
all
amount of information.
with all the information overload, there'll have to be someone who will be the tour guides through it all.
Exactly. I mean, that's what created librarians in the first place. I mean, back in the days when the monks were writing out the manuscripts and keeping them in the monasteries, they knew what was there. They didn't need a librarian as such. And then they got more and more prolific, and suddenly we had to invent ways of organizing and accessing, and it's got to be the same basic
Right.
issues again,
Issues.
but on a grander
And
basis.
another thing he expressed this morning was that there'll be a role in management of the machines. That the people are now networked with all the objects will be networked. What did he say? Millions of computer chips and anything and everything in just a few years.
It's
And
going
somebody's
to be a
going to
shame when
manage
somebody
that.
from wherever is able to change my thermostat without my knowing it at the house. Bad enough that they can apparently read my emails now.
Right.
Not that I say anything of interest to anybody, but who knows? Maybe I should be more
Less heat.
creative and see if I get a knock on the door. Well, Dan, we're sort of nearing the end of today's conversation, but I want to ask if there's anything we haven't talked about that you'd like to mention. I think you have a few items, or another item or two here.
Yeah, let me see if I can pull up what I want to pull up. Well, I just want to thank the people that I've worked with. I've had 3 wonderful directors in Morris Cohen at Yale, Morris Cohen, Diana Vincent Davis,
Yeah.
and Blair, who I was highly suspicious of it one time because I didn't see him as being as much of a bibliophile as Morris.
Well,
but he's surprisingly a
Yeah.
bibliophile.
And more,
currently-
Blair came up in an interesting fashion. He started off at the Judicial College in Utah. I wasn't really even an academic in the normal sense, law librarian, but then he went to Northern Illinois and, basically got that place shaped up. I don't know if I should say it that way, but it was. And then he was at Wisconsin for a while, which is a major place, and then he came to Yale. And we were all a little surprised, or I was.
I think he's a consummate manager.
Yeah.
He seems to have very good relationships with the dean.
Well, he's
And
got
I
good
think
people,
I
too.
think the Yale Law School is doing very well. We've just finished a new strategic plan,
Uh-huh.
and we brazenly say that our mission statement is that we want to be the best academic library in the country. And I think I have colleagues that are committed to that.
Good.
Good.
I'm sure you'll get a good run from some folks up in Cambridge and others,
Right.
but why not?
Right. I want to thank my colleagues who do foreign international reference. Teresa Miguel, who's the associate librarian for administration, who's our Latin American specialist. Evelyn Ma, who's our East Asian specialist. Brian Harrington, who is kind of responsible for Europe and for major reference duties. John Nan, who's associate librarian for instruction and reference, who is a selector for United Kingdom, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the European Union. All these people are really quality people. I've had two colleagues who have moved on, both who had PhDs. Ken Rudolph, director of the University of Luverne, and Mark Ingsberg, who's director at Emory, and they certainly left a mark on the institution. And I wanted to show you the creativity of all these creative minds. Here's how they made little bullet shots of terms for the library: agile, creative, representative, service focused, data driven, respectful, transparent, accountable, and green.
In green.
And green.
I guess you don't use too much, many trees.
Well, we
or
work on
something.
being, I'm the worst user of paper still by
Well,
far in the
I'm an old
library.
paper printer. I just wore out one paper printer and had to buy a new one to replace
It's
it.
a problem of the generation. But the younger minds use much less paper, and they're much more green conscious. Bless
Yeah,
them.
my daughter works as a lawyer for an insurance company, and almost nothing goes by paper anymore.
Oh,
She
wow.
said everything's PDFs.
There was a time when
Sending it
there
all
was
over the place.
a lot of paper.
Yeah. So maybe that's being green now. I don't know. Unless we're having to burn the wrong things to produce the electricity to run that equipment. I don't know about that.
Right.
Yeah.
So I just express my gratitude for the wonderful experience I've had both at Yale and in the association. I've really enjoyed my colleagues and working for them, and working on having a national, international interest in foreign international law.
You've done a lot for the association and for the profession, Dan, and
It's been fun.
it's been a fun trip, and you and I are sort of the same vintage, so I
Right.
imagine at some point in time you'll be sort of drifting on into
Right.
retirement or something.
Well, I have to tell you about Mr. Wilkerson. Mr. Wilkerson was someone who worked at Library of Congress for 55 years
Uh-huh.
and retired at age 81, and he's kind of my role model.
All right, that's all right. Remember Roy Mirsky was he I think was in his mid-80s, and he was still active at the University of Texas as director.
I only work part-time at this point because I have to spend about 15 hours a week on dialysis, but I really appreciate getting to work those hours and continuing to build library.
Well, maybe on that, I should take the opportunity to thank you for having this conversation
Well,
today
thank you.
with me as part of the Hein Spinelli's Law Library Reference Shelf Oral History of Law Librarianship. And when I thank you, I'm thanking you not only on my behalf, but also on behalf of Michelle Wu, Frank Kodak, and Dick Spinelli, our colleagues with whom I have the opportunity to be involved in creating this history. It's been conversations with people like yourself that make it all more fun to do. Thank you, Dan.
Very good. Well, thank you for the project.
Thank you.